All right. Hello. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you might be in the world. Thank you so much for joining me here today. My name is Maria Wickavila, and I'm super excited to walk you guys through how I think you should structure the next 2 months of your time. If you are planning to hit those round 2 deadlines, you've only got a couple of months. Maybe you haven't really started assembling your applications yet. What I'm going to walk you through today is not only the steps that I think you should take, but also the order in which I think you should be taking them in order to make the most of your time. So I am going to share my screen. All right, my slideshow earlier, the reason it took me a few seconds, my slideshow was kind of freaking out a little, so we're just going to have to do it in this view. I apologize in advance, but that's okay because the content is still the same. So let's jump right in. Here's my agenda of the things that I think you need to be doing right now in order to maximize your time. And here's the order in which I think you should be doing them. And I know there's like a lot here, but don't worry. First of all, applying to business school has a lot of steps, but that's why we keep ourselves organized with step-by-step guides in order to not freak out. And for each of these steps here, I'm going to go into a lot more detail during today's presentation in order to make sure that we're all on the same page, okay? But just to give you a quick overview, here's how I think you should be structuring your time between now and the deadline. Number one, I think you need to figure out who your recommenders are going to be if you haven't already. Then you need to reach out to them to give them a heads up that you're going to be requesting that they be your recommenders. I do not want you to quite right now share with them the recommendation link or tell them to take off and start writing because I want you to guide them. So we're going to get to that in a second, but at least I want you to give them a heads up right now that you are going to be requesting that they be your recommender. Then I'm going to want you to reach out to current students and alums from your target schools. Then I'm going to want you to write your business school application resume. I think it's a good thing to get out of the way now, and you might need it just in case for your networking efforts. Then we're going to brainstorm the stories that you're going to use for your application. Then you're going to allocate those stories between your essays and your recommendations. Once you figured out where you're going to allocate your stories and which stories you're going to ask which recommender to talk about, that's when you are going to approach the recommenders formally with your document to try to help make things easier for them. More on that in a minute. Then you're going to fill in the application forms, and then I want you to buckle down and write the essays. And after that, everything should be out of the way, and then you can hit submit, and you can finally breathe. So super quick, who am I? Hi. Guys, it's me, it's Maria. I am a 2005 graduate of Harvard Business School, and I am also the founder of ApplicantLab.com. I don't know if you've started looking at what admissions consultants charge, but it's quite a lot. Most admissions consultants of my caliber, and when I say my caliber, I mean I have been giving admissions advice now for 17 years, and I'm a graduate of Harvard Business School. So most other admissions consultants like me charge $365 an hour, $480 an hour, or even $500 for just 1 hour of their time. When I discovered this, I thought that was sort of ridiculous. And so what I did is I took all of my advice and all of my admissions giving process and breaking down the process into easy steps, and I created ApplicantLab.com. It costs $349 for all of the guidance for everything that you need, not just for one. You don't just get 1 hour, but you get all of it for less than the cost of 1 hour of other admissions consultants. So my mission is to level the playing field for access to this elite advice, but at not an elite price point, right? World-class advice at an affordable price. That's my mission. That's me. Don't just take my word for it that it works. I was the winner of the HBS Alumni New Venture Competition. I'm the only admission service officially endorsed by the Harbus, which is the Harvard Business School student newspaper. And not now, but after the presentation is over, because I want you to pay attention right now, but after the presentation is over, you can check out my reviews on GMAT Club. I've got over 100 5-star reviews and counting. So with that out of the way, let's dive right in to what my advice is. Okay, so step one of the things you need to be looking at or thinking about right now is you need to think about, if you haven't already, whom you are going to ask to be your recommender. So in case you're brand new to the process, most schools, their first choice preference is that your current boss or your current supervisor be the person who writes at least one of your recommendations. It's true that some schools have reduced it down to one recommendation, in which case, if a school only asks for one recommendation, their very strong preference is that it be your current boss. If a school asks for 2 recommendations, they would like one of those 2 recommendations to be your current boss or your current supervisor. So first of all, that sort of helps narrow it down a little, but it's not that easy, right? A lot of you may not feel comfortable approaching your current boss, especially in today's economy, right? You might worry, rightfully so, that if you go to your boss and say, hey, look, I'm thinking of abandoning you guys, 8-10 months from now to go to business school, that might not go over so well, right? It might be a career limiting move if you decide to sort of share these plans. So if your boss is someone that you think is perhaps vindictive, or someone who will freak out at the thought of you perhaps leaving to go to business school, don't worry, a lot of people are in the same boat as you. So if for whatever reason you cannot ask your current boss to be your recommender, don't worry. Admissions officers get it. They are human. They are empathetic. They understand the situation that you're in. But if it's not your current boss, it does need to be someone who is ideally above you, or someone who has been above you at some point, someone who has managed you or worked closely with you in a supervisory capacity at some point. It has, so maybe this is someone, for example, if you work on cross-departmental projects, it might not be your boss, so let's say the vice president of your department, but it might be the vice president of an adjacent department who has seen you work and who has seen you lead. And so that person might be able to write about your contributions, even if they're not your direct supervisor. Now, if even that's not possible, who you need to think about is you need to find someone who has worked closely with you in a leadership setting. They have to have seen you in action, working with others, motivating others, and leading others. That is the best possible person. If they cannot speak to your ability to lead others, the recommendation will not be strong. And as a result, it's kind of a waste of time. So you want, especially this year, because with COVID, the application numbers are way up for a lot of schools. They're up considerably because of the uncertainty in the economy. I also suspect that with the recent US election results, and hopefully this will mean much more friendly, rightfully so, friendly attitude towards immigrants and foreign students. My hope would be that international applications will also increase now with the results of the election. So it's going to be a super competitive year, guys. So you're going to want your recommender to be as strong as possible. So you're going to want them to be able to answer the questions that the admissions officers are looking for as well as possible. So ideally, it's someone who has worked with you in a leadership setting, either at work, or perhaps if work isn't possible, someone in a community service role. So if you are active in a nonprofit, someone that you've worked with there could also be a great recommender. Ideally, though, no matter what, it has to be someone who does not owe you anything. So in other words, why do I say that? Because if the admissions officers think that this person owes you something or has some sort of ulterior motive in saying really nice things about you, then there's not going to be a lot of credibility, right? So for example, the most blatant example of this is if you work for a family business and your boss is your mother. Obviously your mother is going to be like, she's the best thing ever, and she was the cutest baby, and also she's wonderful, right? So you can't really trust that that's going to be the most measured or objective recommendation, right? Similarly, someone who reports to you, probably not a good idea, right? Because that person, even if you're a really nice boss, they probably still want to impress you on some level. So they might feel really pressured to say nicer things about you than they otherwise would. I see this sometimes, please do not ask any college professor to write your recommendation, because professors only know you on an academic level. Academics are usually things you do by yourself. So if you did a research project for a professor and it was amazing, that's great, but that's not what admissions officers are looking for. The MBA is not an academic degree. It is a professional hands-on degree. So your ability to conduct academic research or, some sort of amazing in-depth analysis for a professor, that's nice, but that's not what business schools are looking for. The only time I would really be on board with you asking a professor is if that professor, if let's say you were the president of the student body for your undergraduate college, and that professor was like the advisor for that club, and so the professor has seen you leading other people. But otherwise, professors are not appropriate, or a vendor also for your company. So if you have a small company or a family business or your own company, If it's someone who's selling you something, then of course they're also going to want to stay on your good side. So if you work for a family business or for a smaller company, maybe it could be someone like a client of yours, or perhaps an investor or some sort of other mentor. And why is it so important that they've seen me in a, that doesn't make any sense, Maria. Why, my professor knows how smart I am, and so shouldn't that be the thing that matters? It doesn't, because business schools are looking for leadership, right? If you've seen any of my previous presentations, or if you go to any of my blog posts, you'll see that what business schools are looking for are people who can lead others to achieve good results. So for example, every recommender is going to be given a grid like this. I know it's too small for you to read, so let's zoom in. So for example, this is the Stanford Business School leadership grid or personality grid. And so right here are two examples of things that the business school wants the recommenders to check, right? So there are different check boxes. So for example, the ultimate or the highest level of recommendation that you can get will say, for example, in terms of your initiative, is this someone who proactively seeks high impact projects and steps up to take over things, even if the project isn't going well, right? Because it's easy for anyone to be a leader when things are going well. The real test of leadership is when we step up for something that might not go well, right? So that is sort of what Stanford defines as being the highest level of initiative. Similarly, for innovation, is this someone who invents new approaches to attack things? Do these new approaches have better results that can be measured objectively, and works with other people to deliver best-in-class performance improvements? In addition to these grids and these like personality traits, every recommendation also needs to answer two questions. So if you're new to this process, you might hear like, oh, I need a letter of recommendation, so I'll just ask someone to write me a letter. Let's be clear, the letter of recommendation is not necessarily in a letter format. There are two specific questions. There are a few different questions that every recommender has to answer, but the two most important ones are the following. How does the performance of the applicant compare to that of other well-qualified individuals in the similar roles? In other words, what is this applicant good at? And in this case, you're going to want your recommender to focus on, again, those interpersonal skills, because that's what the MBA programs are looking for. Similarly, the other question, though, and this is the one where I think once you think about this question, you'll realize that the coworker who doesn't know you that well, or that professor who only spoke to you twice, is not going to be a good recommender. Describe the most important piece of constructive feedback you have given the applicant. Detail the circumstances and the applicant's response. So this is really important, because I think sometimes people, they might know some sort of VIP somewhere, right? Like my uncle's cousin's barber's neighbor's father is the CEO of some sort of major company. And so even though I don't know this person very well, I'm going to ask them to write my recommendation because they have a fancy title, or maybe they went to one of my target schools. And so it's going to matter. It's going to mean more. It's going to hold more weight if they have a fancy title. It does not. Do not go for the person who has the fanciest title. Go for the person who can answer these questions honestly. Because if that person barely knows you, that VIP barely knows you, they're just going to write something like, she's very nice and has always been polite and seems to have good personal hygiene, right? Like they're not going to say anything of substance. And then it's going to be, as a result, like I said before, it's going to be a weaker recommendation. So it has to be someone who has seen you lead others, and who has also at some point has been so close to you that they have said to you, look, love what you're doing, but you might want to think about maybe managing your time better, or you might want to think about being better diplomatically in terms of your organization, or maybe you shouldn't push your employees so hard because they're going to burn out and quit. Whatever it is, whatever that feedback has been, realize that every school wants this person to know you well enough that you have gotten that kind of feedback from them, because they have to write about it. Now, if right now you're sitting here and you're like, well, Maria, the thing is, I'm really good at my job, and so I really haven't gotten any constructive feedback. What do I do, right? Like my boss is on board. I know who I'm going to ask, but I don't, I'm actually pretty good at what I do, so I don't really get a lot of constructive feedback. Yikes. Then this is where you have to actually be proactive, and you have to almost reverse engineer what that constructive feedback is, right? Since you've got now 2 months, right? Until your recommender has to submit that recommendation. So in those 2 months, what I want you to do is go to your recommender now, as soon as possible, and say something like, What could I be, I've been thinking about my contributions to the team, and what do you think I could be doing better around here? Right? What could I be doing better? Like what advice do you have for me? So that way you're almost forcing them to give you some sort of constructive feedback. And then over the next 2 months, you can take steps towards addressing that constructive feedback, whatever it was. So then that way, when your recommender a month from now or 6 weeks from now sits down to write that recommendation, they can say, oh, you know what? I told her the other day that she needed to be better at blah, blah, blah. And then she started doing it. So, right? Like that's exactly right. You're almost kind of, again, reverse engineering the answer to this question. So that way your recommender has something to write about. So that's something you can do starting today or tomorrow. So once you've started thinking about, okay, who have I worked with who can answer these, fill out these grids and who can answer these questions as effectively as possible. If you don't know for a fact that they are on board with you applying to business school, you might want to gauge their interest, right? So you might want to try to say something like, oh, hey, what do you think about the MBA degree? Like, I've been thinking about my long-term career, right? Like COVID, all this stuff going on has really got me thinking about my career, and I'm not sure, maybe I should try to get like a master's in computer science, or maybe I should try to get, I don't know, an MBA or something. What do you think? And then you can try to guide the conversation. If they're like, oh, you should definitely get a master's in computer science, and you're like, well, that's not what I want to do, then you can be like, well, but what about the MBA, right? Don't you think that might be a great thing? And if they say, no, the MBA is stupid, and people who pay for an MBA are stupid, or if you get the sense from that conversation that they are very anti-MBA, then that's a pretty good indicator that you should try to find somebody else, right? Because somebody who is, even if they love you and think that you're amazing, if they're not in favor of you getting an MBA, then the recommendation might be a little bit lukewarm. So that might be a good indicator. Now, if your boss has an MBA, then so much the better. Then you can say something like, oh, hey, you have an MBA. What did you learn from it? I really admire the way that you have gotten us through some of these tough times recently. And is that stuff you learned from the MBA? Like, is that a good experience for you? So that way you can try to gauge their interest. And if they are on board, then I want you to give them right now a heads up that you're going to be giving them some more information soon about being your recommender, but I don't want you to quite give it to them yet if you haven't already been very deliberate and very thoughtful about exactly which stories you are going to want them to talk about, right? So just give them a heads up like, hey, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to get back to you. Thank you so much. And you'll hear from me a little soon. But I don't want you to jump in right now, because until you've figured out exactly what you're going to ask them to write about, I don't want them to take off on their own, like, and then start writing and then submit the recommendation before you've had a chance to try to sort of manage the process and orchestrate things to your advantage. So the other thing I want you to be doing right now, and I want you to start this today, tomorrow, start reaching out to students and alumni from your target programs. So the easiest type of students to find would be people called admissions ambassadors. Lots of schools actually have a page where you can either send an email to the sort of the generic admissions ambassadors email list, and then someone will pick up that email and get back to you. Other schools even have, you can search for admissions ambassadors based on their backgrounds, based on what country they're from, based on what they used to do for a living. So that way you can really find someone whose background matches yours. So that's your first step. If a school offers admissions ambassadors, take advantage of that resource and reach out to them. Also, you should look up the professional club that you are most likely to contribute to. So for example, let's say you work in finance and you are going to join the investment banking club. I want you to reach out to someone in the investment banking club. Sometimes the clubs, if you go to the club's websites, will have like different officers, right? So sometimes there will be an officer that's called something like admissions liaison or prospective students, click here. Right. So I think the other day I was looking at the Wharton Women in Business website, and I'm pretty sure they have a section that's like prospective student, click here, right? Reach out to us. Now, if a club does not have someone who is a dedicated admissions resource, try to look up the officers that are in the club. There's usually Trust me, it's business school, so everyone's a VP of something. Like if there's 20 people in the club, all 20 of them ends up being VPs of something. It's kind of silly. So there's not going to be a shortage of officers for you to reach out to. There's going to be a ton of people, usually for the bigger clubs at least. And so try to find if there's any of them like, okay, like maybe this person went to my college, or oh, look, this person used to work for Price Waterhouse and I work for Price Waterhouse, so maybe I should reach out to them. Try to find someone that has something in common with you and then reach out to that person to try to talk to them. And so why am I going to reach out to them? What am I going to talk to them about? Well, first of all, a lot of schools actually come out and ask you on the application form, how many students have you spoken to? So right there, if you wait until, if let's say the deadlines are January 5th for a lot of these programs, if you wait until December 25th to reach out, it's going to be too late. You're not going to get a chance. No one's going to write back to you because it will already be the holiday season. So a lot of schools flat out ask you, how many students have you spoken to, or what resources have you used to try to find out information about our school? What I want you to ask them is, what resources does the school have to help advance people's careers? How has recruiting been going? And not just in general, but specifically like, hey, I am a software product manager right now, and I think I want to get into strategy consulting. Have any members of your club with a background like mine been able to get a job in strategy consulting, right? I know that strategy consulting jobs are really hard to get. Has anyone like me been able to get that job? Because if the person says yes, then that is something you can add. Almost every school, not every school, but almost every school will give you an opportunity to write something in an essay somewhere where you can say something like, I spoke to the president of the consulting club, and she said that last year 5 other product managers from your class got jobs at certain consulting firms, right? So that way, that gives you credibility. When you say, this is the career path I want to pursue at your school, it gives it a lot more credibility if you can cite somebody who was able to follow a similar path, who had a background that's similar to yours. So if you get it sort of straight from the horse's mouth, as it were, from a current student, it's going to be that much stronger of an argument. You also want to ask them what's been their favorite thing about the school. This will really help you get a sense of not only things that you can highlight in your application essay and later in your interview, but also will start to give you a sense of the different cultures of different schools. The schools are not similar. They have some similarities, of course, but they have different cultures. They attract different types of people. They have different resources, right? Some of you who might have been on some of my other webinars in the past, you'll see like some schools, like every school will offer classes in real estate, right? But some top schools will only have maybe 2 or 3 classes in real estate, and another school will have over 10 classes in real estate, right? So be a savvy shopper, right? This can be your chance to really start to get a sense of which schools you should prioritize more so than others. And ideally, as I alluded to before, you're going to find someone who is a resume twin. And what I mean by a resume twin is someone whose pre-MBA experience looked really similar to yours. Because if that person was able to get into this school and then follow that career path, there's a better probability that you will also be able to do that. So if you work for a larger company that has sent people to business school, try to reach out to those people. It's important that those people have been in functions that are similar to your function. So for example, if you work for JP Morgan, but let's say you work in the IT division that's building internal apps for the traders to use, it's not enough to say, well, look, here are some people from JP Morgan who got into Wharton. Look to see if those people from JP Morgan, were they also working in the IT division, or were they traders, or were they investment bankers, right? So you have to find someone who had a similar job to yours. And if you are trying to make a career switch, especially if you are applying with the story of a career switch, which sometimes is not always the best idea because it does add an extra level of scrutiny to your application, right? Not only can this person be successful in our class and successful in their career, but can they also successfully make this career switch? If you are applying with a story like that, it is all the more important for you to find a resume twin who made a similar change. So that way you can cite them and you can mention them and you can say, I spoke to 3 other product managers who made the same switch that I made, right? Or I spoke to 3 other bankers who made the switch into product management, or whatever it is, because that helps give you credibility and gives me as an admissions reader relief. I feel like, okay, well, if other people have been able to make this switch, then he'll probably be able to make the same switch. And so I'm not quite so nervous now about their career prospects, which strengthens your application. The other thing I want you to do soon, maybe this is something you spend after you reach out to people over the next couple of days, and you've got those emails out and you're sort of waiting for people to get back to you. I think the next thing I want you to focus on is building your application resume. If you search the GMAT Club video archives, I have an entire presentation on why the application resume for your MBA application is not the same resume you use for job hunting. If you want to go to the free trial of Applicant Lab, this is absolutely free. I have in the free trial a resume template. I have a sample of a bad resume and a sample of a good resume, and I explain the difference. That is absolutely free, so you can check that out. And why do I want you to start working on the resume now? First of all, the resume is the first document they usually read in the application. I don't think there's any admissions officer in the world who will read a set of essays before first reading the resume. Because the essays will normally ask things like, tell us about a time you did something that was leadershipy, that made a lasting leadership impact on an organization. Or tell us about a time you had to convince someone of something. Or tell us about a time that you made a difference. So no one is going to read that essay first without first having a sense of okay, who is this person? Where do they work? What do they do? Et cetera, et cetera. So realize that the resume is the first document they are probably going to read. It matters more than the essays because the resume is where you really convey your top achievements as a leader and where you convey, hopefully, that sort of upward trajectory that your career has been on. Right? It gives them a sense that, okay, this person has made an impact and they've been rising in terms of responsibilities in their career. So now we feel that this is a safer bet for someone to accept into our program, right? So it's important for you to start the resume now. The other reason to start it now, it gives you one less thing to worry about, right? As these deadlines approach, they are going to be here sooner than you think. You might think I got 8 whole weeks. It's 2 months. I am sitting pretty. I'm just going to relax and watch Netflix. No, it's going to come really fast. So get it out of the way now. Get the resume out of the way now. The other benefit of getting the resume out of the way now, it's going to help you brainstorm your stories by forcing yourself to sit down and write your resume and think about what are my greatest achievements, what have my biggest accomplishments been that I'm going to put in my resume. That's going to jog your memory. So then when you sit down to write your essays about your achievements and accomplishments, they'll be much fresher in your head. So that's the other reason that starting with the resume is advised. And also finally, as part of your networking, right? If you start reaching out to students or alums of your program, you may want to include a copy of your resume with that email, right? Hi, dear Marketing Association. I'm a prospective student. I currently work for an advertising firm. I'm interested in joining your MBA program. In case you're wondering, I've attached my resume just to give you a quick sense of my background. They might not read it, they might not have time, but they might look at it to see okay, is this person a serious candidate or do they have no chance? So if you send them a resume, if you send them some jumbled, garbled, tiny, 6-point font, full of jargon, hard to understand resume, they're going to look at it and be like, oh, right? They're not going to be super excited about helping you. So having a nice, easy to read, easy to understand resume to send out right now for networking purposes will only help increase the number of responses back that you're likely to get. Okay, with that out of the way, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to brainstorm your stories. And what do I mean by stories? And what are stories? Why are they so important? Okay, so in no essay at any point do I want any of you to say something like, I am the sort of leader who believes in including everyone and listening to all opinions. That's just the sort of person I am. Blah. You can't just say that because if you don't have any evidence that that's the sort of person you are, anyone could say anything about themselves, right? If you were just reading an essay from me on paper and you didn't know anything else about me, I could say something like, well, I'm the starting center for the U.S. Olympic basketball team. I'm 6'2" and I can slam dunk better than Michael Jordan. Like, no, there's, if something doesn't have evidence, you're going to be like, well, why should I believe this person? So when people tend to write things about themselves, and when they tend to be especially positive things about themselves, realize that there's not a lot of credibility there unless you bring receipts, as the young people say today, unless you bring proof or evidence that this is in fact the sort of person you are. So in your essays, instead of saying, I'm the sort of person who leads by getting everyone's opinion, don't say that. Tell me a story about a time where you did that. And therefore, it will be proven to me like, oh, this is the sort of person who gets everyone's opinion, right? Don't come out and say it. You need to show me by telling me a story about a time that you did it, right? So in terms of, okay, what stories am I going to need to build a strong application? At a minimum, you're going to need at least to brainstorm to get started, at least 3 leadership stories. You're going to probably want at least 1 for your set of essays, probably more, perhaps depending on the school, but just for like the basic typical application, you're going to need at least 1 sort of leadership story to talk about for your essays. And remember, again, your recommenders, each one will have to answer, what are you strong at? And so again, just like I said, for you, you can't talk about yourself in vague terms. The recommenders cannot talk about you in vague terms. The recommenders cannot say, well, he's a very good leader and he is really smart and he is really motivated. No, that's not good enough. They have to tell a story that shows you being a good leader who's smart and motivated, right? So keep in mind, like, okay, you don't just need to brainstorm stories for yourself and for your own essays. You also need to start brainstorming stories that you're going to give to your recommenders and ask them to write about on your behalf. So don't panic, though, if you don't have a ton of leadership experience. Remember that your recommenders can talk about the same event or the same project, but they can talk about it from a different angle. So for example, perhaps you have a big leadership, or you led a big project last year that was really successful, and that's where you want to focus the bulk of your application. You can maybe write in your essays about the fact that someone on your team wasn't pulling their weight. And then you can focus the story in your essay about what you did to bring that person along and get them to start contributing. Your recommender can write about the same project. That's perfectly fine. But it's a wasted opportunity if they also write about how there was a team member who wasn't pulling their weight and how you helped them start pulling their weight. That's a missed opportunity because now it's just repetitive and it's not adding new information. But your recommender can talk about the exact same project, but bring up a detail that you didn't bring up in your essay. For example, maybe your recommender can say, look, our senior staff didn't think that she was going to be able to pull this off, right? One of my fellow VPs, the VP of marketing, came to me and said, why did you give her this project? I don't think she's going to be able to make it happen. And then by the end, she convinced him that she was the right person for the job, right? So your recommender can talk about the same story, but they can come at a completely different angle to explain what you did or to explain how you impacted things. So keep that in mind. Don't stress out that they all have to be completely separate projects. They can be the same project, but you're going to want different angles if it is the same project. If you're applying to multiple schools, I want you to try to think about at least 5 good leadership stories. And one more thing, they don't all have to be from work, right? If any of you have been active in community service or something in extracurricular, maybe at your company, let's say there's an organization, if you work at, this tends to be more common in bigger companies, but if you're at a bigger company and let's say you're a member of the LGBTQ support team, or right, like the sort of the what are they called, the employee resource groups for people, different types of, like the women's group or the minority group or the whatever, like that can also be a place where you demonstrate leadership that is not necessarily at work. You're also going to need probably 2 failure stories or stories where you were not at your best. Mostly, some schools will ask you to write essays about them. It's become less and less common for that to be an essay. 15, 20 years ago, it was super common. They loved having essays. Now, more and more schools have pushed the failure story to the interview because I think they want to see you live talk about your failure as opposed to writing about it where it's going to be more crafted. But again, remember the recommenders. Remember that second important question they have to answer about a time you gave the person constructive feedback and what was their response. you don't get constructive feedback if you do everything perfectly, right? So there has to have been a time where you did something that maybe you weren't at your best. Maybe you didn't do it perfectly, exactly the way you should have. So you're going to want to think about those stories because, again, you want to try to guide the recommendation narrative. You want to sit down, we're going to get to this in a second, it might be the next slide or two. You're going to want to sit down with your recommender and say, look, you're going to get asked about a time that maybe I wasn't at my best, or a time that you gave me good advice. So I would like for you to talk about this story. Because if you set them free and give them just the question prompt and don't give them any guidance about what you would like them to talk about, they might choose something that is way off the rails. And you want to try to, you don't tell them what to write exactly, but you do want to try to guide them and hope that they pick the stories that you ask for. So you're going to want to start thinking now about those stories. All the more reason why writing your resume first will help, because as you're writing your resume and you start really brainstorming, you're going to start to remember things that maybe happened 4 years ago that are not top of mind right now, but will start to come back to you. Okay, so once you've got your stories, you're going to want to pull up the different essay questions for your schools and think about, okay, if this particular school has these questions, and I know I've got my 2 recommenders over here, I know that I don't want things to be completely repetitive because that's a wasted opportunity. But I need to be strategic about which stories am I going to talk about in my essays, and which stories am I going to ask my recommenders to talk about. So I want you to sit down with a piece of paper, or if you end up upgrading Applicant Lab, in Applicant Lab, I have a drag and drop interface where you color code your stories based on the leadership traits that your stories demonstrate. And then you drag and you drop them to allocate them so that before you even start to write your essays, you've got a good idea about, okay, which essay am I going to write about? Like, which story am I going to write about for each essay, and which perspective or which angle am I going to hit the hardest for each one of these, right? So, for example, here's an example. Here I have a screenshot of Cornell. So Cornell has sort of 2 main things you need to fill out. One is an essay about how do you intend to make a positive impact, both at Cornell and in your career. And then the second question is called the back of the resume question. It can be an essay, or it can be a video, or it can be like a website, like you can make a little website with some pictures and some text and stuff. So basically what I do here is you sort of think about, like, okay, here are like all the different things I could talk about. So in essay 1, I'm going to talk about how I launched Applicant Lab and how I worked on the Tata Sky launch. But then for my back of the resume, I'm going to talk about the fact that, I play field hockey, or I used to play field hockey. I don't anymore. I'm too old. My knees don't work. But I used to play field hockey, and how I moved to Asia and how that was a really big personal thing for me. So allocate your stories before you start to write, because it's hard to keep track otherwise of what your different stories are for different essays, and I want you to stay organized. Whew. Okay, now that you've allocated your stories and okay, I'm going to talk about, in my essays, I'm going to talk about X, Y, Z. Now that you think about what you want your recommenders to say, you can't write the recommendation yourself. Sometimes your boss might ask you to do it. Please beg them to put it in their own words, because you might not realize this because you don't read applications, hundreds of applications a week, the way those of us in admissions do, or in admissions consulting do. But it's pretty obvious when someone has written their own recommendation. There are turns of phrase that you use in your written language. There are words that people tend to focus on again and again. They don't even realize it. It's subconscious. But if I see the same turn of phrase, or if I see the same word being used to describe something over and over again, both in the essays and in the recommendation, that's a pretty good indicator to me that the person wrote their own recommendation. And the schools explicitly do not want you to write your own recommendation. And in fact, they will sometimes discredit someone or reject someone only because they think they wrote their own recommendation. And how do we know that they take this very seriously? Some schools even track the IP address of where you are accessing the application to submit your stuff and where the recommendations came in from, what IP address. So they're really serious about this, because they don't want, if they see that the recommendation is uploaded from the same IP address that wrote your essays, they're going to assume that you submitted your own recommendation, and that's going to be a pretty big red flag. So you can't write it for them. You have to beg them to please put it in their own words. However, while you can't write it, you can try to influence what they say. Think of this as a test of your leadership skills, right? The application process itself is not only looking for leaders, but the application process gives you a chance to be a leader in terms of influencing another person, influencing someone over whom you have no direct authority. And so the way that I want you to try to influence it is, for your recommenders, I want you to provide them with a document. Maybe it's in an email, in the body of an email, maybe it's a separate document, not a PDF. It has to be something that they can edit. I want you to write out which strengths and stories you would like them to focus on. And I don't want you to say, this is what you have to write about, because some of them might be like, whoa, you don't tell me what to do. But I want you to phrase it more like, I would really appreciate it if you could please focus on these. I think these are I don't know what you think, but I think that these are some of my best stories. So maybe this is what you could write about, right? So you're trying to move them towards what you want. And so write out, like, which feedback story do you want them to talk about? Which angle or what details do you want them to include? Because you can think to yourself, okay, I'm going to talk about the teammate who wasn't pulling their own weight, but the detail that she can talk about is that VP that didn't believe that I could do it, right? So you're going to try to basically massage it by including important details, because this makes it as easy as possible for them. Recommenders are really busy. By definition, they're usually more senior than you are. Otherwise, they wouldn't be your recommender. So they'll probably have a lot on their plate. So the easier you make it for them, the more likely it is that they will at least follow what you want. And therefore, it makes it more likely that your application will be as strong as possible. And also, again, many well-meaning recommenders who love you, who adore you, who are on your team, they unwittingly damage someone's chances because they focus on the right. If you don't try to guide them at all, they might, with the best of intentions, damage your candidacy by focusing on the wrong thing, right? By talking about, like, oh, she's very, very good at Tableau and doing doing correlation analyses in Tableau. Who cares? That's not the sort of stuff MBA admissions offices care about. So a very well-meaning recommender who is not guided might actually shoot you in the foot. So be aware of that. Now, the next thing I want you to do, you might think to yourself, well, this is what a weird thing for her to say. She wants me to fill in the application form, like the actual form itself. That's so silly. Why is she having me do this now? Like, that should be like the last thing I do, right? I mean, I collect all of the other stuff I'm going to need. I collect all of my materials. And then the last step will be to fill in the application form. No, this is a mistake, because the application forms go well beyond other application forms. Like if you filled out an application form for a job, for example, you might just need to put like your name and your address and your government ID number or whatever. MBA application forms are way longer. They can include things like little text boxes for you to describe, what are your career plans? Why do you want to pursue this career? What in your background makes you qualified to pursue this career? For each job that you've had, some schools will give you like sort of one big box to just sort of talk about in general, like describe what your role has been. Other schools will give you, 3 different boxes that will be like little text boxes with little text limits, right? Key responsibilities, key accomplishments, and key challenges. And also these boxes usually have, like I said a second ago, character limits, like 250 characters, 400 characters. It is really hard to smush, if you've had a job for 5 years, to smush your 5 years of experience into 250 characters. These little boxes take a lot more time than you think they're going to take. So I want you to start filling those out as soon as possible. They're also going to ask you for descriptions of awards that you've won, community involvement. As I alluded to before, any research that you've done, they're going to have you say, like, which students have you talked to, or things like that. Many, not every school asks it, but most schools do. So I want you to get this out of the way now and not wait until the last minute, because I think a mistake people make is they say, well, I'm just going to focus so much on the essay and the resume, and then on the day of the deadline, I'm going to log in and finally fill in the form. And then you get to the form, and you're like, OMG, there is so much here I need to write. And it's asking me for my responsibilities at work. So I'm in a hurry. I don't have time. Let me just copy and paste things from my resume. I do not want you to copy and paste things from your resume into the application form. It makes you look sloppy. It makes you look like you don't care enough to merit. If they wanted it from the resume, they wouldn't ask because they already have your resume. They wouldn't ask for a separate text box describing your accomplishments if all they wanted was the description from the resume, because they've got the resume. So the fact that they're asking you to describe your accomplishments in a little text box is a signal to you that they don't just want it from the resume. They don't just want it exactly from the essay. They want a separate thing to be written. So I want you to write these first, because this is going to help you not only get it out of the way and not be panicking on the day of the deadline, but also, when you start writing your essays, think about, okay, I already told them on my resume about this project. And then in the little box, I already gave them these details in the little text box describing my accomplishment. So what other details do I need to give them that are not already elsewhere in the application? Right? So that way, when the reader gets to the essay, which is going to be the last thing they read after they read the resume and the little boxes that you fill out about your job, then they're going to get to the essay. And if they feel like the essay is just repeating stuff that they already know, it's going to be kind of boring, because admissions readers are human. You would feel the same way too. You'd be like, oh yeah, it's the exact same phrasing. Like, yeah. I know about the brainstorming session with the 15 executives. You already told me about the brainstorming session with the 15 executives up above or on a previous page, right? So it's important to do this now because it also helps guide which details you write about in your essays, so that you don't, or at least you can write about the same details, but don't write in the exact same way, because it's going to be repetitive and make it seem like you don't really care. You don't care enough to put in the effort to write separate things. Woo, okay, then what you're going to do next is you are going to write the essays. If writing the essays were a quick one-slide process, then no admissions consultant would have a job and no one would ever need to use Applicant Lab. But here are some quick things that you can do on your own. Ask yourself, what is the question really asking? In terms of specifically, which information is most important or most relevant for a business school admissions officer to know about me, right? If we know that business schools are looking for people with interpersonal leadership skills, and that's one of the main things they want, right? People who are able to persuade, people who are able to inspire, people who are able to motivate others and get things done through other people. Okay, given that I know that this is what they're looking for, what do I write about in a way that shows me being that sort of a person and doesn't focus on details that are perhaps a little bit irrelevant? And as I mentioned before, keeping in mind what they already know about this project from elsewhere in the application. When you sit down to write your essays, I want you to write as much as possible. Don't start your first draft thinking about, okay, there's a 250 word limit for this essay, so I need to be, don't do that at first. I want you to, it's easier to write a lot and then cut. I worry that if you start your first draft thinking about the word limit, that you will try to censor yourself and you might miss something that's really good or really important, right? So just at first, the first draft, I want you to just don't even think about what the word count is. Just write the story out. And then the next one here, I put this in all caps because it's important. These essays are not academic essays. These are not like the college essay that you wrote about the role of existentialism in the Sartre play or in Huis Clos and how French existential. No, this is not about philosophy or literature. Verily, I do not want you to try to impress me with superfluous multisyllabic words. A big mistake people make is that they think, well, I'm applying to a fancy university for my MBA program, therefore I need to use a lot of fancy words. Like, instead of saying, I realized that we needed to act fast, someone might say, like, my perspicacity led me to observe that I needed to, implement changes immediately. Like, no. I want you to write these in the same way. If you were talking to someone at a dinner party, how would you tell the story? So please write this with a conversational tone. Write out the story, write out the details, and then later go back and ask, okay, what can I cut out? What here is repetitive? What here maybe isn't all that important? And then from there, it's easier to write more, write it conversationally, and then cut. And then another thing I want you to do is, this is a common mistake that I see over and over again. Double check parallelism in your essay before you get ready to submit. And what I mean by that is, for example, if it's a leadership essay, sometimes people will say things like, whew, I was put in charge of this project and it was really complicated because first of all, the team was demotivated. Second of all, the client was too demanding. And third of all, the deadline was too tight. And then later in the essay, they talk about how I was able to convince the client to extend the deadline. And there was my solution to the problem. But then they forget to talk about the other two problems that they brought up earlier. Or conversely, someone will say, well, I was put in charge of a project and it had a very demanding client. And that's why it was challenging. And so I did this stuff to motivate the team and I did this stuff to get, to make the deadline longer. Or like they don't match up. They introduce solutions to problems that were never established earlier. The problem was never described earlier in the essay. Or conversely, they're like, oh my God, here were the 5 different things that were really hard about this situation. But then they only focus on 2 solutions instead of 5 solutions. So and in case you're like, well, I wouldn't do that. A lot of people do it. If I didn't see this in a lot of essays, I wouldn't be mentioning it right now. I see it a lot. So just make sure when you're going through those final drafts, because you're going to start with a lot and then you're going to cut, make sure that in that cutting, if you cut out, let's say you did 5 separate actions to solve a problem, but you only have room to talk about 3 of them, make sure that earlier in the essay, you don't talk about 5 mini problems with the 5 different solutions, right? Make sure that there's a direct parallelism and that you're also talking about things in the same order in one place or another. So for example, for the essay, most schools will ask a question about why do you want to come to our school? So if you say, well, I'm really interested in going to Wharton because of its academic, extracurricular, and leadership offerings. In the essay, don't talk about the leadership offerings first and then go into academics, and that, right? It has to be in the same order. You know what I'm saying? So like if you list things at the very beginning, like here are the 3 things I'm interested in from your school, talk about them in that order, because otherwise it's going to seem like you're not very organized with your thinking. And then, in the sprint over the next few months, if you do things in this order, my hope is that you will not be panicking a day before the deadline and suddenly being like, oh my God, you mean I need a 1-page resume? You mean the school is telling me it has to be only 1 page and my current resume is 3 pages long? Or I just logged into the application form and there's all these little mini essays that I need to fill in. I'm trying to avoid that. So if you follow the steps as I laid them out just now, hopefully you will not be sort of in that panic moment where like, your heart starts going crazy out of control and your stomach starts going blah. Like I don't want that to be you. So hopefully if you follow these steps, by the time you get ready to submit, you will have already filled in the boxes. You will have already had your resume good to go. Hopefully you will have already started editing several versions of your essays. So before you hit submit, I want you to double check everything. Not just typos in the essays, that's an obvious one. Also make sure that your spell check gets it correctly, right? So spell check, sometimes people will say, I got the client to sign the agreement, but they misspell it as sing the agreement, right? Because they switch the N and the G, but spell check won't catch that, right? So you need to read your essays. The easiest way to do this, honestly, sometimes is to just read the essay out loud and listen to yourself. That's another way to catch run-on sentences, right? Oftentimes people try to smush together into like a monster hybrid sentence that should really be 3 separate sentences. They try to smush it all together into one. The easiest way to catch your run-on sentences is to read out loud. And if you catch yourself like having to like inhale several times and take several breaths before you get to the end of the sentence, pretty good indicator that your sentences are too long. So that's it. So reading your essays out loud, maybe recording your own voice, and then listening to yourself and saying like, okay, is this clear? Is this making sense? That's a good tip that I have. Double check even things in the application form, like the dates, your salary info, right? You have to enter in how much money you make, and also the school name. It is very easy for people who are in a hurry, and it's very understandable that you might say, let's say you have to write something called an optional essay to explain why maybe your grades in college were not that good. In the optional essay, sometimes people will say like, okay, well, even though my grades weren't that good, I know that I can handle the academics at your program, and I know that I'm ready for the strong academics at Stanford. And the thing is that you might write that same little spiel, that same little blurb for all of your schools, and sometimes you might copy and paste it, and you might leave the name Stanford in your Wharton application or vice versa. So please double check to make sure that you don't do that. I would also urge you to try to submit at least one day in advance or very, very early on the deadline day. So if they say, okay, the deadline is January 3rd at 5 p.m. Eastern, do not log in at 4:30 p.m. Eastern and try to upload everything, because the thing is that all the other procrastinators do that too. And sometimes the systems crash. Sometimes, you try to upload the form and all of a sudden the PDF is not uploading because there's too many people hitting the server at once. So try to submit the day before. And then after you hit submit on an application, I want you to stop thinking about applications. I want you to take a day or two off if you can, or maybe if you've got a bunch of applications due all at the same time after your last application is due. Take some time off and don't think about applications. Treat yourself. Watch that silly reality show on Netflix that you're embarrassed to admit to your friends that you watch, right? Take some time off. Go do some exercise. Treat yourself to a well-deserved reward, because regardless of the outcome, applying to business school takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of thinking and a lot of reflection and introspection. And the fact that you've even gone through this process and you've put yourself out there and you've tried to do it, that deserves praise, right? So I want you to pat yourself on the back for even attempting this process, right? Because it's not only shows that you are someone who really cares about your career and is willing to put in a lot of effort, but the process of going through and really thinking about, like, what do I want from my career and what type of a leader am I? It's actually beneficial. It's actually beneficial for you even if you end up not going to business school. And also try to remind yourself, and I know it's hard to do, but remind yourself that getting into business school is not the be all and end all for your life, right? If you wanted to become a neurosurgeon and you didn't get into medical school, that's tough, because you cannot become a neurosurgeon, at least not a legal one. You're not allowed to operate on people's brains unless you've gone to medical school, right? So for people, just keep in mind that there are people out there whose dreams in life involve the requirement of getting into school, like a neurosurgeon, right? You have to go to medical school to become a neurosurgeon. If you do not get into medical school, you will not become a neurosurgeon 100%, right? Forget it. Business school is different though. You don't need an MBA to work in business. You don't need an MBA to be successful in business. Most top business people out there don't have MBAs, right? You can look this up after we're done. Look up what percentage of the Fortune 500 CEOs have MBAs. And then go take it one step further. And for the ones who do have MBAs, look up where they got their MBAs. Sure, there are some people out there who went to Harvard, Stanford, whatever. But there are a ton of people out there who are CEOs of big companies who went to, local universities, who went to schools that you've never heard of. If they have an MBA at all, there's a chance that it's an MBA from a school that is not top of mind for you. So don't panic and think like my whole future depends on me getting into this MBA program. It doesn't, right? There are so many different paths that you can take, and there are so many different ways that you can achieve your goals. And also remind yourself, you're going to get multiple shots at this, right? If you don't get into business school the first time, you can always reapply. You can always wait a few years and then apply to an executive program or apply to a 1-year program for mid-career professionals. So it's not like you only get one shot and then, if you don't make it this time, forget it. You're never getting an MBA. You're done. You're never going to get a business education. Forget it. There are so many different paths forward. So remind yourself of that in order to relax. And so as you go through the application, here's all the different stuff that you need, all the different pieces that we just talked about. Applicant Lab costs $349, less than the cost of 1 hour of other admissions consultants versus $8,000 or more that other admissions consultants want to charge. So please check out Applicant Lab. Check out the free trial, like I said before, for seeing my resume stuff, my resume, what it's called. Oh, a template. That's the word I'm thinking of. To see the template, at least at the minimum, do that. And I hope this has been helpful. So, Abhijit, I don't know. I know we're technically like a minute over. So I don't know, do we have time for questions or what should we do? How much time? Let's do 15 minutes of Q&A. Let's do that because I did start a little late because my thing was freaking out a little. My slideshow wasn't working, and anyway. Okay. So, okay, thank you for the questions. Great. So Kriti wants to know, what are the chances of getting scholarships in round 2? So the chances of getting scholarships in round 2 are the same pretty much as round 1. In fact, some schools the scholarship committees may not even start to meet until the round 2 acceptances have all been given out, right? Because schools will have sort of a limited pool each year of scholarship money. They might give out some of that money in round 1, absolutely, but they're not going to give out all of it, right? Because they want to wait to see who comes in round 2. So round 1 and round 2 are normally about the same in terms of getting scholarship money. If you do apply in a later round, which you shouldn't do. Last year was a weird exception because a lot of schools extended the deadlines and they did crazy things by not requiring GMATs. But normally round 3 or beyond round 3 is not a good idea because by then the scholarship money usually is used up. By then it might be harder for you to get a student visa in time if you're from another country, et cetera, et cetera. But for round 2, for scholarships, you should be fine. Nico Steins wants to know, can you rehash advice on GMAT prep? I guess this means prep and apps. Between a goal from 720 to 750, how much time should I allocate between apps and prep for a retake, assuming an average of 40 hours a week that can be allocated? Wow, 40 hours a week, that's a lot. Okay, so I think, first of all, I think, Nico, this is one of those things where you have to examine yourself and really be honest with yourself about what type of worker am I and what type of student or learner am I. There are some people out there who do better when they multitask. So let's say you've got 4 hours a day to devote to your application process. Some people might say, well, I'm going to do 2 hours a day of GMAT, 2 hours a day for everything else, because I like having, the GMAT prep provides a welcome distraction from everything else, like the essays, and the essays provide a welcome distraction from the GMAT prep, and therefore I'm going to balance it out together. Personally, I operate better if I focus on something a lot and then get it out of the way. So I think for a lot of people, it makes a lot more sense. Let's say you want to retake the GMAT between now and applications, and you've got 2 months. Maybe the best thing to do is once you get some of those first steps out of the way that I talked about, like who is my recommender going to be? And, oh, let me reach out to some students. So those things are sort of time sensitive. And since they involve things that are not under your control, it's better to get started on them as soon as possible, right? Because you can't force your boss at the last second to be like, hey, I'm applying to business school. I forgot to tell you. And by the way, you need to submit these 5 applications by next week. And I know it's Christmas or Hanukkah. I know you're on vacation, but could you just do you can't force other people to do that. So that's why the other people aspect of this, I want you to get started on that as soon as possible. But once you kind of have those feelers out and you've given that recommender the heads up and you've started talking to the potential students, personally, what I would do is I would then focus entirely on GMAT prep for 1 month, knock it out of the park, get it behind me, and then focus the second month just on the parts of the application that are under my control, filling in the application forms, writing the resume, and writing the essays. But you know yourself better than I do. So this really does take being honest with yourself and saying, am I the sort of person who does better if I do a little bit at a time? Or am I the sort of person who does better if I just sit down and focus and power through different things? So I'm sorry that I don't have like a concrete answer. I would personally focus, intensely on the GMAT for a few weeks, get it out of the way, and then focus intensely on the essays. But that's just my style and my personal, how my brain works. So do what's best for you. Nita wants to know, how many applications could be a sensible target with only 1 month in hand? So Nita, this is, again, I'm not trying to avoid your question. I'm not trying to sidestep it, but it really depends on the person. It depends on, a lot of how much time do you have and how good of a writer are you? And, do you need to really sit and think deeply about your leadership stories, or do you immediately have them top of mind? I have had people who use my program say that they've been able to do 5 or 6 apps within the course of a month. Realize that the first application or the first 2 are kind of the hardest. And then once you get the hang of it, it becomes a lot like sort of it's like anything, right? Like when you first start to learn to ride a bicycle, it's a lot of effort and a lot of stress and a lot of pressure. But then once you get the hang of it, you're like, oh yeah, no big deal. So it's the same thing with applications. Once you do like the first couple of them are going to be like so much work and so much thinking, but then especially since some schools often have similar essay questions, like for example Wharton and Columbia Business School have very, very similar applications. So if you do one of them and you spend a lot of time, the next one is going to come out a lot easier. So I think it's possible to do 5 apps within a month if you're sort of motivated. And I urge most people to apply to about 6 schools. Don't apply to just 2 schools unless you're okay with being a reapplicant next year. I've got a little video on my website of like my son skiing last year. And he's just like skiing and nothing is close to him. And for no reason, he wipes out. He just tumbles over and just eats snow. And it's funny because I have it on the Applicant Lab site as like, this is what it's like if you only apply to Harvard and Stanford. This is very likely going to be you, right? You're going to be the person who just like, boom, like you self-inflicted disaster. He was fine, by the way. He's not hurt. If you were hurt, I wouldn't laugh about it. But you know what I mean? Like when people only apply to, I'm only going to apply to 3 schools, that is not a good idea. Definitely try to apply to at least 5 or 6 because in any year, this would be my advice, but especially because this year is so much more competitive than previous years have been. So that would be my advice for you, my preference. Seba wants to know, which should I pick as a second recommender? A former direct supervisor who worked with me, who worked with me 3 years ago and knows me well. B, my boss's boss who works with me now but knows me less well. Okay, so Seba, here's what I would say. First of all, I'm guessing that because you have your previous boss and your boss's boss, that your current boss is in fact one of your recommenders. So that's good. Then what I would do is think about, remember when we talked before about allocating our stories? Think about what will each of these people say in response to these questions, right? If we think about the 2 core questions they have to answer, what are this person's strengths? How do they compare against other people? Why are they better than other workers, basically? And then also tell us about a time you gave the person valuable feedback. Ask yourself, who's going to write the better story, right? There's a chance, look, I would say all else being equal, the previous supervisor might be a stronger one because you worked for them directly. So I think that would have more credibility. But it's also possible that 3 years ago, maybe you weren't the leader that you are today. Maybe 3 years ago, you were in a very junior position and you weren't able to show off how good your people skills are. Maybe your boss's boss can talk about something that your current boss can't. It's unlikely, though, because if your boss's boss doesn't work with you directly, they're probably going to know the same things about you that your current boss does. So I worry that it would be a little repetitive, but if they can provide a completely different angle, talk about a completely different project, and if that person has given you feedback, they might be a good person. But all else being equal, without knowing any other details, I think the previous boss is probably your better bet. Akshay wants to know, is it a good idea to write about the people we spoke to in our essays? Yes. I think, first of all, realize this is why it's also good to do the application form first. Realize that in the application form, you might get a chance to list out those people, right? So you might not have to really talk about it in the essay because it might already be elsewhere in the application. When it comes to reaching out to students, I should have said this earlier, it's about quality, not quantity. So I don't want you to reach out to 20 students and be like, Jane Smith said this and John Doe said this, and then someone else said that. Like, that's not great. But if you talk to a few people, yes, you can drop their names in. I'd rather have you have like 3 really good conversations with current students as opposed to 21-minute conversations that are very shallow, right? But so yes, it's perfectly fine to say, I spoke with so-and-so, class of 22, who said that blah, 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 right? Like, that is, for most schools, the schools that do not care about that, Harvard does not care about current students. And also, I believe that Stanford does not really care. But other schools do like to see it because it also shows that you love them, that you took the effort to try to get to know them, that you went out of your way to talk to the current students. So again, don't go overboard. You're not going to get, at a certain point, there are massive diminishing returns. Like talking to 7 people is probably not going to yield you any more advice or insight than talking to 2 people. But absolutely, you can absolutely mention them in passing for sure. Okay, Seba wants to know, there is a value of my dream school that resonates a lot with me. I'm afraid to mention it in my essays because I would sound too condescending. Should I rephrase my arguments to avoid that wording? This is a great question. So Seba, I would say, unless the question says like our 4 core values are, let's see, what's a school? Berkeley has like confidence without attitude, students always, like whatever. Like let's say it's one of those schools that has like, here are our 4 principles. If the question asks you which of our principles most resonates with you, like I believe Kellogg MMM, that design joint degree, I believe they actually have a question that says, here are our principles, which of them most resonates with you? Then in that case, it's fine. But if you're trying to convey it in a more subtle way, you're right, I would not use that exact phrase. So if the value in question, let's say, is confidence without attitude, and let's say it's actually more about, humility, like I would not say, because I'm someone who has confidence without attitude, this is what I did. I would try to get that value across. I would try to show that I'm the sort of person who has confidence without attitude. But remember what I said before, you can't say, I'm someone who's so humble. I impress people. People are always so impressed with how humble I am. Like, it's not quite right. But tell a story in which you demonstrate that trait. Absolutely. That's a great way to sort of think about the school values this. I have this story that shows me being the sort of person. So let me talk about that story in my essay. 100%. Can we say to the AdCom that I have not informed my manager about my MBA plan, so I won't be able to get a recommendation from my current manager? Yes, Aravind. So you actually, in fact, schools, if you do not have your current boss as a recommender, schools will actually give you, remember how I said before that in the application form, there's tons of little mini essays? This is another mini essay. A lot of schools will say, if your current supervisor is not your recommender, use this space to explain why. And so that's where you will say, my current boss does not support me going, or my company is doing a lot of cuts and layoffs because of COVID, and I worry that I might get laid off if they find out. Like, that's absolutely, schools will, in fact, it's not just that you can do it, it's that schools actually ask you to do it for the most part. Sam wants to know, Maria, what can people with specific trades, like for example, plumbing or casino gaming, as pre-MBA work experience do to show their business readiness? Okay, Sam. So I think, first of all, if you don't have sort of a typical pre-MBA job, I do think that the standardized test is going to be more important for you than it might be for others, because it will show sort of that academic readiness. No school wants to let in someone who is going to struggle and be miserable during the program, right? Because that's not good for anyone. Right? Nobody likes being the stupidest person in the room. And so no school wants to let in someone who's going to be like, well, everyone else, it takes them 20 minutes to do the homework. If they think someone's going to take them 3 hours to do the homework, they're not going to let that person in, not because they're mean or snooty, but because they just want everyone to have a good experience. So I think for people from non-traditional backgrounds, realize that the standardized test will probably matter more for you in terms of establishing that academic readiness. In terms of showing your business expertise, realize that leadership comes in many forms, but at its core, it always involves working with other people and being able to influence others without authority over them, right? Excuse me, sorry. That's when I talk for an hour straight, I start to lose my voice. Sorry. So for example, if you've worked in a casino, maybe you were able to convince the casino to do something different. Maybe before they used to hire people in a certain way and you thought that that hiring practice was unfair. So you talked to the head of HR and you convinced her to change the hiring practice. Or I don't know, maybe there was some other ways, like maybe the training program for the casino wasn't very strong. And so you stepped up and said, you know what, guys, I think we can train people better. And let me devise a training program that helps people on board better. So you can show that ability to persuade others, that ability to improve outcomes for other people or to lead teams to do things, that can happen in a variety of contexts, right? So just because you don't work in a quote unquote business setting doesn't mean that you haven't shown those business leadership skills. And if your job has not allowed you anything like that, then that's why a lot of people will then instead focus a lot on community service. So if you're still a ways away from graduating, from applying, and you haven't had an opportunity to be a leader at work, either try to start being a leader at work as soon as possible, or also find a nonprofit that you can get heavily involved in where you can demonstrate that you have those leadership traits, even if your formal job does not allow you to do it. And then you can say in your application, my job doesn't let me do it, but here's my evidence that I am this sort of person. Do I apply? Do I help for PhD programs? I do not. Sorry. The PhD and the MBA are two completely different fields. The PhD is an academic research degree. If you want to work in business, I do not recommend that you pursue an MBA. You only pursue a PhD. If you want to be a professor who researches business and who studies a lot of data sets and comes up with theories about how business works and then teaches those theories in a classroom university setting, then the PhD is for you. Aside from that, though, it's a completely separate process because you have to prove that you're different things, right? For a PhD, you have to prove that you're good at teaching and you have to prove that you're good at researching and coming up with innovative ideas, sort of industry-changing, earth-shattering ideas on your own. So it's not my program is not based on that. What would you suggest to folks with 3 years of work experience? If we've taken on more responsibilities in these years and have a good academic score, should we apply this year or the next? So there's no damage to applying this year. I do think that people with 3 years of experience are often a bit early. But the real question is, if you realize that most people in the applicant pool have a certain level of accomplishments, if you've already reached that level of accomplishment at the 3-year mark instead of, say, the 5-year mark, then go ahead and apply. There's also nothing wrong with reapplying. Schools don't penalize you for reapplying necessarily, right? If so, there's not a huge downside to applying this year. You might as well apply, and make sure though that your recommender in the recommendation says something like, even though he's only 3 years into his career, he's currently doing the responsibilities, or he's currently had the impact that other people usually have at the 5-year mark, right? So your recommender, if you say it, it sounds kind of gross, like, I'm so amazing, I'm very precocious, and it's kind of if you say it about yourself. But that's why your recommender can brag on your behalf, and your recommender can say, in the 20 years that I've been working here, we've had, very few people have been as impactful at only the 3-year mark as this guy. So think about that, and then that'll help you. Okay. All right. I said I was going to do 15 minutes, but this will be our last question. Hi, Maria. Thanks for the previous answer. Feeling nice to learn that you work for Tata Sky. I did. When I worked for it wasn't even called Tata Sky. I wrote the original business plan. And that was before we had identified Tata as our strategic partner, because I worked for News Corporation, the Sky. I worked for the Sky part of it, not the Tata part of it. Oh, you worked for Tata Sky Broadband. Great. I hope to go to HBS like you too. Yeah, all the best. Can I mention the clients I've worked with for in the resume? I'm currently working for Tesco as a contractor. Could it be of any advantage while applying to European schools? Yes, first of all, the fact that you work for Tesco is a European company. So be sure I think you definitely should try to put those in. Just be sure first that your employment agreement allows you to mention it, because some people who work, say, in management consulting are not allowed they have NDAs where they are not allowed to publicly state who their clients are. In that case, you can say something like, I did work for Europe's 3rd largest grocery chain, right? So that way, like, you don't name the company, but you sort of imply who the company is. But definitely that helps establish your credibility, that you can work with big clients, that you've been given high profile jobs, and that you've worked, in this particular case, that you've perhaps worked internationally with people from different cultures. So definitely do that. All right, that's it, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Again, check out applicantlab.com if you're looking for an online, affordable, do-it-yourself process that will walk you through all of this advice and more. All right, thanks so much. Oh, and yes, like the video. If you found my advice helpful, the more likes I get, the more likely I am to be asked back to give other presentations. So please like my video if you liked it. And best of luck to everyone. Take care and stay safe. Thanks.